Welcome, everybody. Good evening. I am Julie Moody Freeman, and I am so happy to have Dr. Foreman Bandama with us this evening, who will talk to us about art, Black magic, or science, masterpieces of African metallurgy. Before we get started, I would like to do some acknowledgements. Again, I'm Julie Moody Freeman, and I'm the director for the Center for Black Diaspora. I definitely want to welcome you all for just taking the time out of your precious evening. Before we get started, I'd like to acknowledge our co-sponsors and thank our staff. The event is co-organized by the Department of History of Art and Architecture and the Center for I really want to thank Dr. Mark Delancey, the chair for the Department of History of Art and Architecture, because he has been so wonderful in organizing and moderating all the events we've had. We've had 3 before, Constantine Petridis, Kathleen Berzog, we've had Marianne Ibrahim, and our 4th now, Dr. Foreman Bandama. So thank you so much, Mark, for doing this. Thanks also to the staff without whom none of this would be possible. Jessica Williams and Jennifer Ogwumike, who are the student assistants, and then Catherine Douglas, the administrative assistant at the center. I will turn you over now to Dr. Mark Delancey, Chair of the History of Art and Architecture, who will introduce Dr. Bandama.
Hi, thank you, Julie, and welcome everybody. I want to thank the Center for Black Diaspora and especially Julie and the staff for making this all possible. This has been a wonderful opportunity, and I've had a great deal of fun bringing these people to speak and interacting and fielding the question. It's been a wonderful experience. So thank you for that. Our speaker for tonight is Foreman Bandama, who received his bachelor's in archaeology from the University of Zimbabwe in 2008 and his PhD in the same subject from University of Cape Town, South Africa in 2013. From 2014 to 2018, he was a postdoctoral research fellow at the University of Cape Town, following which he was a lecturer at Sol Plaatje University in South Africa from 2018 to 2021. And as of this past year, he was appointed Assistant Curator of African Anthropology at the Field Museum of Natural History here in Chicago, as well as an adjunct lecturer at UIC. He's published a total of 22 book chapters, online articles, and journal articles, including in the Journal of Archaeological Science, the Cambridge Archaeological Journal, Archaeometry, the African Archaeological Review, and others. And his 2018 co-authored article in the journal Antiquity entitled Elites and Commoners at Great Zimbabwe, Archaeological and Ethnographic Insights on Social Power received the Best Paper Award. Dr. Bandama is an African Iron Age archaeologist who specializes in pre-industrial ceramics, glass beads, archaeometallurgy, and heritage studies. His doctoral thesis explored the history, innovation, and technology of tin and bronze metallurgy in Southern Africa. His work draws liberally from both African theory and his personal experience as a product of a rural crafting Tsonga family from Zimbabwe. Dr. Bandama is particularly interested in African innovations and achievements relating to complex societies and their interactions with the outside world. Among his long-term projects are understanding crafts, class, and state formation at Great Zimbabwe and some of the key polities in Southern Africa. So with that said, please join me in welcoming Dr. Bandama for his presentation.
Greetings and welcome, everyone. I hope I am audible enough. Thank you. I want to thank the organizers for inviting me. The first time I got this invitation, I was across the Atlantic, stuck in South Africa, with an appointment accepted, a visa petition that was ready, but there was no consulate to stamp my visa. So I wasn't even sure I was gonna be able to move to Chicago last year, but thankfully I did, and I'm here. Thank you so much for having me. Let me move straight into today's talk. I will talk today a little bit about what entertains me at night when I'm sleeping, and then we'll talk a little bit more about hopefully what I think might entertain you. So we basically going to talk about the metallurgical production line, the questions of the origins, what part of art is black magic, and what is art, and what is science. But more importantly, this is just to give a background to myself and as well as to the work that I hope to be doing much more here in Chicago. So there's very little of Chicago results that you see here, but of course I began to put down some thoughts and some lines, and hopefully with your help, we can certainly do something much better. As I'm standing here as well, I joined the Field Museum last year, but I found them at a very critical juncture where they are rethinking the Egypt and Africa halls for the Field Museum. And hopefully we'll get as much feedback and collaboration to anybody who is available and ready to help. So yeah, there's my call out to you, if you can help. Perhaps let me start by the story of Africa. We all know that for a long time, the continent has been denied history. It has been dissected into different parts. Perhaps the biggest crime of all is how Egypt was taken out of Africa and considered to be something else that is not African. So the Egyptian history is, in most cases, most published books, dissected and separate from the rest of the African continent, which is not a good picture considering the lot of connections that are there within Africa and of course Egypt. But that's not the main story, but the whole story can be generally summed up in this, that we haven't told the story of Africa enough. I think there's so much room for us to give one more ear to Africa and to see what Africa can do. But for me, I do this from the background of archaeology. I specialize specifically for my PhD in archaeometallurgy, which is just dealing with metals from archaeological past. And these objects, they do stand out, at least for me, as having a lot of potential to highlight, what history Africa had, what science Africa had, what innovations exist in Africa. But more importantly, is that even though the continent was being denied any science, any innovation, any connections to technology, during the early years of contact, most Western travelers, they thought it was not robbery to get some of the African objects which looked entertaining and outstanding enough. So we have most of African metallurgical objects, for example. Of course, this is not just limited to metallurgy, but we have got most African objects, anthropological objects that exist today outside the continent, including here in the US. And most of them, they left the continent unceremoniously, mostly through cunning means of violence, as well as bribery and several other means, just to get some of these objects out of the continent. In as much as that is not a very good picture, but I think today it gives us an opportunity to talk, perhaps an opportunity we would never have had if some of these objects had not left the continent. So today they remain, some have been retained, a few, but the good majority still remain outside the continent in most of these prominent museums and research institutions like universities. But in all these places where they are, I think they still remain a little bit mum. They haven't been given a voice, at least not enough for them to speak the story of Africa. And I do realize and recognize here that, you know, people in the field of art history, in the field of science, you know, they do have a role to contribute towards giving this voice to these objects and making them talk and talk the African story. And I see, of course, museums still have a special role and special place because of the access and the distance to the public, unlike research institutions and universities that rarely reach to the general public almost on a daily basis. So yes, like I said, my background is in archaeometallurgy, and I must put this disclaimer at the beginning that whatever I'm going to talk about today, it has nothing to do with other forms of art. You may have other sculptures that are carved by wood and stone and other forms. I have very little specialization there. I just want to zero down today to the archaeometallurgical examples. And archaeometallurgy itself is a discipline that is relatively recent, especially in Africa. But it just basically the use of modern scientific technology or analysis to look at the chemical or the physical properties of either the metallurgical objects themselves or the production debris in order to reconstruct that technology. And this is made possible because most of the metallurgical products, they are products of high temperature processes. And by that, they retain all the history of the transformations that they would have gone through in the process. And I think what this does is that it allows archaeometallurgists to then go back to the past and look at the material, analyze them scientifically, and be able to reconstruct history. So we can tell if there was any history or not, or we can tell if there was any science or scientific thing at all. So that's what archaeometallurgy does. And because of that, just to highlight that people can study archaeometallurgy from different specializations and perspectives. Like I said, some may specialize on the finished products only without looking at the production debris. But for me, I deal with the whole production line from the time when people start thinking of prospecting or looking for metal-containing rocks and how they do that mining, how they prepare the place for the smelting process, how they do the smelting itself, the smithing and forging process, as well as to how they then begin to bring this into the use, the trade and the recycle sphere. And within that, as an archaeometallurgist, I'm also interested in the people. What were their choices as they were doing whatever stage they were at in terms of the selection of the raw materials, the tools they use, how they order those events and organize the whole production, who is doing what role in the group, or perhaps it's an individual, or that is of interest because it links us to the people. I just have selected a few examples of the ores that are familiar, just for us to at least refer to them. The metallurgy of Africa, especially sub-Saharan Africa, can be limited to a very few metals and alloys. So irons, the oldest and perhaps the most widespread and the most famous. But some of those iron ores, like some types of ore like specularite, they have also been mined for non-metallurgical purposes. Now, in fact, the oldest mines in the world, they have nothing to do with metallurgy, but it's about getting this specularite that is used for rock art, the paintings that are done in the caves and the rock shelters. But there's, of course, later on we see hematite, magnetite, and several other types of iron ores being mined. And for metallurgical reasons, gold really, really dug most of the gold. It was through the washing, alluvial panning. We have got several types of, copper, one of the early metals as well in the continent, a little bit widespread and requiring a technology that is less complex compared to that of iron, but at least it does exist. We know tin, when mixed with copper, it gives us bronze, and this has been one of the key alloys that we see on the continent. Later on, we've got other alloys like zinc and copper making brass, but these are not as widespread in terms of the mining of zinc in the continent. I've just frozen a little bit. The slide is not moving, but I hope we'll be able to get back to that. Thanks. So yeah, just more examples of the penning process that I was just trying to highlight. You can see the typical penning where you go on the riverbank and you wash, and just a matter of density separation, you can be able to tell which one is heavier, which one is lighter, and be separate and come up with the ores from the riverbanks. But most of them, of course, they end up going underground. In most pre-colonial times, this was limited to the water table. So rarely did they excavate beyond the water table. Once they hit the water table, they would then move on to the next mine. Just highlighting some of the map of Africa. For those who are familiar with the continent, I specifically left all the country names just so that you can be able to tell. If you are able to get at least 5 countries, then welcome to Africa. If not, please book your next plane. But in terms of the origin of metallurgy, which is very important because that's where we see some of the earliest debates. I want to call them the attacks on the African continent. So the continent has been assaulted severally. And we see here, the first has to do with the claim that Africa only received from others. It did not itself produce any significant technology to talk about. Metallurgy is one of the things that are also suggested to have been borrowed also from outside the continent. We see that in terms of the early dates of metallurgy, they are clearly perhaps not all in Africa. If we consider the developments within Egypt, we may consider Africa to be represented, but most of the early metallurgy that we see is in the Middle East, and there are debates about the dates, how soon, how late can this be? At least if we include what's happening in Egypt, some may stretch this to 11,000 BC, to do with the burials in which the Egyptians used to pick those bright colored copper ores. We saw some of them there, and trying to use those as some of the decorations within for the dead bodies. Obviously, if you have got copper and you have got an open fire and one of the rock might end up in there, you may end up realizing that this rock reacts differently when it's heated under certain conditions. So perhaps that could have stimulated people to begin metallurgy. But a key thing to pick here is that the beginning of metallurgy in the Middle East, that's Eurasia and Europe, was very, very, very gradual, a very, very slow process. They started off with copper, and that's why we have the copper age there. And then over time, they moved to bronze, which is giving the bronze age. And then later on, they ended up with iron. Perhaps, the use of meteoric ores might have led to some of those heat treatment processes that perhaps might have melted or led to smelting, but it was a very, very slow and gradual process. But we see the beginning of metallurgy in Africa, especially in sub-Saharan Africa, very, very, very different from the pattern that we see in Europe. How different is it? Is that we see iron and copper being introduced at exactly the same time. That's in West Africa, Central Africa, and parts of East Africa. We don't have a lag time. What took Europe and Asia years to master in terms of the movement from copper to iron happened, at the same time. in the continent. And because of that, many suggested that perhaps this technology is not local, it's diffusing, it's coming from outside into Africa. Otherwise, how did the Africans identify or figure out what took millennia of years in Europe and Asia to achieve? Otherwise, it does not make sense. So they suggested it must have been coming from outside the continent. The challenge with that is that they had to find out the roots. How did it come from where? And how did it enter the continent? So yeah, several routes were proposed, including the northern ones, which are the obvious ones because of the connections with Europe and Asia, which is where they thought they could have come. East Africa and the Horn of Africa, other possibilities. But the challenge, I think, with that is that it just created more confusion and did not solve anything, because most of the deaths that you find on the interior, they are older than those that you find on the conduits or on the coastal sites. So how then did this technology end up deep in the interior without having to pass through those ports? And so that obviously shows that it cannot have been borrowed, at least not that easily, from outside. And that created the possibility of a local origin hypothesis. And many people even went on to hypothesize that if we look at the diversity that we have in terms of the African metallurgy, there's more diversity within the continent than you have outside, and that might be attesting to experimentation, that these people, they were also experimenting just like others, and might have come up through those several experiments, might have been able to come up with the metallurgy without the help of the outside. We see the experimentation in terms of the furnace types, just a few examples I picked here, the bellow types, even the technology itself, there's so much diversity. If you look at the products of the African metallurgy, that diversity does show that the people have an aptitude towards innovation and experimentation. And of course, we've already highlighted that the interior deaths, they're earlier than the conduits, and that takes away the possibility of an outside borrowing. Just also to highlight those furnace types we were talking about, I have got here images of the three types: the natural draft, also known as the tall shaft in some instances. Some of them, they're as tall as 7 meters, so they're really tall. And these natural draft or the tall furnaces, they basically use the convectional currents principle, where cold air is sucked into the furnace. It's heated, it becomes less dense, and it escapes from the top, and then cold air is sucked in again. The concept of that convectional currents keeps on firing the furnace for a few days, and then you come back and you have your metal. We have got, of course, the other two types, the low shaft, which is more like the natural draft, but this is, it's called the forced draft type, where you have to pump the bellows to force the air into the furnace. And so these would definitely not be taking as many days during the smelting process. You can do it, within a day you are done. You also have the much smaller ones, the bore types, which are almost like the same, except that they don't have a superstructure. You just dig a bit of a hole and you cover a little bit of the top, and you start your smelting process, and perhaps within a few hours, you already have your metal. The bore types were very common among the Zulu speakers in South Africa, and those of you who are familiar with the Zulu, they are one of the most powerful, empires that grew much later on in the 20th century. But we see the ideas of innovation and experimentation do come here. The first image you are seeing to the left is that of the Poka furnace, which is found in Malawi. This particular community did specialize on smelting very low-grade iron ore, some of it around 40%, which today you can't take to any industry because they have no idea how to work this, and it's too low-grade. It cannot do much, and because of that, but this community had figured out how to do this by mixing. Because the technology that they were using was basically not melting the iron, but melting the impurities. The challenge with doing that is that the impurities like silica or alumina and others, they've got a much higher melting point than that of iron. But under certain conditions, you can lower the melting point below that of iron, which is exactly what this community did. And these are some of the key innovations that nobody would be able to see on peak by just looking at the finished product, or looking, you need to understand this technology much better. The second attack has to do with that Africa does not have any technology to talk about. What we see there is black magic. In the very early years of conduct, we see a lot of European travelers coming to Africa, some anthropologists, some missionaries, all trying to record as much of what they are seeing as possible. Even some documentaries were done about metallurgy, about several other things. And in the process of doing this, they realized that there were a lot of rituals that went into this, a lot of taboos that were associated with the smelting, especially of iron. The slaughtering of animals, sprinkling of blood, the whole trade in most cases is done outside the village. It's done exclusively by men, and these men have to abstain from sex for those days. And the specific one who lights the furnace, in some cases they have to strip, so that they do it naked, and all sorts of these rituals just confused a lot of the Western world recorders, and they considered everything done to be just magic. There's no science in this. They ask for their recipes. Where is your recipe? How do you come up with this? What's your formula? There's no written formula. There's no, so to them, it looked like this is just black magic. It's just, hocus pocus. There's nothing. They just, I don't know what they're doing, but it's not science. And because of that, it was just derided and looked down upon, and never really considered to be a very sophisticated technology, of which, if you look at the finished product, that was almost always the case. You look at the finished products, they were almost comparable, if not even higher than what you had in Europe at the time. And so that threw things a little bit off balance for most people. And if we are to look, this is just the same example that we're just seeing there of those guys that were trying to smelled that previous image. It's the same technology that we are seeing in this particular image, where you've got what they call this downdraft furnace. Basically, the guy up top to the left is pumping the bellows. The guy, just down there is the one, that's where the metal will come out. And you can actually see what is happening here. So here, this is a specific but very useful technology. You can see the blow pipe, which is that pipe that is going between down to almost the bottom, which is a clay made tuya. It's called the blow pipe to feed the air into the furnace. It's inserted very long and deep into the furnace. Part of this is also meant as a way of also sacrificing the tuya, so that during the smelting, it starts to form slag. It encourages the formation of slag, and it melts away as well. And that in doing that, it facilitates that process of quick formation of slag, and it helps the whole smelting process to happen. So this is complicated technology. It's definitely sophisticated. For people to come up with this, they would have thought about several options. But look at those decorations that they are putting on those furnaces. Those are the decorations that are putting people at least off balance. Like we said, most of this was ritualized, and the whole smelting process is thought to be a reenactment of, the procreation process, the tuya representing the malehood, and you've got the opening there of the furnace representing the female. And all of this just threw people a little bit off balance, and they were not able to understand, and they considered all of this to be black magic, but in the process, they missed very significant science that was happening in terms of the thinking that went behind coming up with some of this technology. And we realized that most of the cases, most of what you have within sub-Saharan Africa, there is this crossover between technology and the non-technological aspects. most people consider technology to be floating in the Western context, where it must, if it applies to me, it must apply to her, it must apply to everyone else everywhere, and it must be explainable, because this is how Western science is perceived. But within the African context, there are a lot of these connections that are also there. Like, for example, the furnace had to be decorated in that way because it's considered to be a female body. And you can see this overlap in terms of the decoration trying to mimic those decorations that you also have on the female body, and even what the females would wear. This is a particular example amongst the Shona people, where we are seeing that the names for the same decorations that you are seeing on the apron there is the same that you would find on the clay pots, the same that you also find on the furnaces. And they are so explicit examples, illustrations of the furnaces with those breasts that you can clearly see, and the baton and several other pieces. All of this just trying to show that technology is not technology without the people. The people make up the technology. And so you need to make those connections between the technology and the people. And to just discard the whole technology as black magic because of your failure to understand the connections, it's also missing the point. It doesn't make us better. We don't understand things better by doing that. Okay, the third attack it has to do with the art. So when, of course, the objects have now been acquired, most of them, they're now in houses in Europe, and they're also in people's bedrooms, they're also in museums, at research institutions. But what did we just get from Africa? Compared to what was happening in other places in Europe, others were saying, this is art. But of course, there was a lot that also was misunderstood, and it was considered either, number one, that is not art at all, because art has to be something of beauty and visual power, which is devoid of function. In other words, of course, if you strictly adopt this definition, even with some of those European examples of forms of art, like the one that you have in several churches and other places, would also have to be disqualified because they do serve other functions as well. So it was just a way of people who were prejudiced against Africa and not wanting to accept. In those cases where it was considered to be at least art, then the thinking was that then it must not be African. We found it in Africa, but there must have been some earlier unknown European or Asian group that might have traveled there and produced this. And this was the case even with the rest of the archaeology. Places like Great Zimbabwe, they were also considered to have been built by Phoenicians and other foreign people. But all of that was just a way of trying to deny Africa its own history and its own contribution. Within Africa, most of the art is considered and viewed within the context of a skill. So there are several names for art that imply and suggest skill or know-how, which is of course with some inherent visual characteristics, something of value. And this definition actually broadens this to include several other crafts, which is why you realize that I've been talking all along here about the metallurgical process, which is actually a trade in its own, or it's a craft. And within that, but if you understand the complexity of the African art, is that it's not just there to serve one purpose or one function or one dimension. It's multidimensional and it's very complex. And because of that, you need to adopt a slightly broader definition and understanding. And most of it, of course, having been collected in Africa and being now presented mostly in the beautiful art museums. But we see the loss in terms of this cross-cultural translation, the misconceptions, as well as prejudice that also misplaced most of what Africa was doing. And it was left, a little bit hanging. We see within the Western art, the assumptions of stylistic progression, that it must start from simple to complex, and it must have some kind of an individual identity, or the artist must sign his name somewhere. That does not seem to happen with most of the African art. And because of that, many people thought it was not art at all. How wrong were they? Obviously, we have spoken about the significance of Egypt. Nobody really questioned Egypt, but because they couldn't question Egypt, they took it out of the continent and they said the rest, I think, is just nothing. But we see here some other places like, Benin and several other places. This is not the country Benin, but Benin, the people who are found in Nigeria. The famous 1897 raid by the British that took a lot of this art from Benin. These are plaques and other items that are cast, metal cast, famously called bronzes. We don't know, of course, some of them are brass and very little have been actually studied, which is exactly why it is important for us to not even look at this exclusively as art, but also give a chance and also consider this to be science. Part of my interest right now is to also study some of these collections to identify what metals they are. We know that some of them were brass, but that has got implications. If they are brass, are they local? Because most of the brass at the time was being imported. If they are bronzes, are they also local? There's local sources of tin, so bronze could have been local. If they are copper, then also could have been local. And there are also implications for the casting of these objects. So this is lots and lots of, this Benin art that has been stolen by the British. It's now all over the world. The ongoing claims of, return of some of these objects, and a few museums have already started doing that, and many others are still in conversation to end up, returning some of this painful part of the past that was beautiful art, but taken in unceremonious ways and left a lot of scars. But because of this, it began to change some of the perceptions of how people were viewing some of the African art. They began to consider that so this could actually be, art. We see here the bronze box that is cast there, trying to show the Oba's house. You can see, the audience chamber receiving visitors. You can see the Oba holding there, the tame leopards and the mudfish, perhaps elements of magic coming back again. You can see the Oba riding the horse. You can see the crocodile biting, the mudfish, even the depictions of some European travelers. All of this just highlighting some of these very highly complex casting, lost to us casting technology that we see in West Africa. What nobody didn't talk about, even when they were doing all of this, is the other complex things that also were happening, even within the context of where this was taken from. If you see, for example, the same Benin City, they had some of these, walls, the mud walls, very high and beautiful. Actually, they are thought to be much even longer than the Great Wall of China. Back then in the 1960s or early 70s, they were actually inscribed on the, in the Guinness Book of World Records as the single largest, the largest single archaeological phenomenon in terms of structures. So they are there, and very few people know about them today because, Africa is not being given enough voice. How many people do visit the Great Wall of China today? Millions and millions of people do that, but we have got the same walls, if not longer. Of course, parts of them have been destroyed, but they still survive. But nobody really talks and know about some of this, and that has been the story of Africa. But then we know that, yes, there is art in Africa. The key themes there to do with innovation forms, where artists have been very creative. Basically, we're not trying to say Africa is very unique. We're just saying Africa, just like other parts of the world, also has artists, and these can also be creative. And surely that's not too much to ask. They also have other forms that are visual abstractions, non-naturalistic forms that do appear there, the parallel symmetries, the sculptural primacy, those showing the 3D form. Then we just saw those plaques that have been cast. They're actually not 2D, most of them, they've been cast with that 3D dimension. And most of them they also have to do with performance, either as part of the attire that people wear during those performances or the props that they're holding when they're dancing and doing some of those songs. And then the humanism that you see trying to depict the one's body or the spirit or some other kind of components to do with the human and society. We also see some assemblages like the shrines, where you see several metals, clays, and other type of materials all put together in some kind of an altar of a shrine. But the key thing is that they usually come with all these multiple meanings. It's very intellectually complex, most of it, and it does speak to a lot of attempts to try and box it into one context will always not produce the intended results. Here's one example. This, you may not consider it art. These are just battle axe used in the first liberation war in Zimbabwe. Those of you that are familiar with the thesis, you may see Robert Mugabe somewhere kneeling down there. At that time, the national leader was Joshua Nkomo. He's receiving this from the first liberation heroes. And they're saying, this is what we use to defeat the enemy. It's now your turn. Take over, use the same weapons to destroy the enemy. Of course, this is now the time of gunpowder and things. They're not expecting anybody to be using that. So at this time, they're no longer functional, but they're now what? They're now symbolic, and they've now become art. They've ceased to become functional. So we see a lot of these things where you've got the context changing, over time. Several other examples, including the Mapungubwe golden rhino, which has to do with the depiction of and the understanding of the concept of kings. So the rhino is associated with royalty amongst the Shona, and several other examples that you see there. The golden ball has nothing to do with anybody putting soup inside. It's definitely putting in there, of course, as decorative and highlighting that the ball as well as the rhino, these are wooden but covered with golden plating. We see several ingots, like the one that we are seeing at the bottom, like the miniature head. Those little dots on top, they have to do with calculating value. So when you're looking at it, you just think it's a normal ingot, but it's not. The same with the golf club. It has nothing to do with playing golf. It has to do with the an ingot that is being sold for value and can be remelted. Look at those holes. You would think that they're all functional. Perhaps yes, but perhaps not. Some of those, they're used there as a form of an ingot. You can change them into a hole, or you can make them into a spear. And you've got, look at that very unusual hole with the tang extending almost 2 meters. All those shows how we need to understand local context. So the science part, of course, we have already said that Africa has been denied science. Now we have got the technology, we have got the techniques, we have got the machines to refute this. We know what was happening within those furnaces. We know how they were able to observe even the changing flames and the color of the smoke to be able to tell if it is oxidizing or if it's not, and they were able to come up with some of these very complex technologies. So yeah, it was not random. So that's what the archaeometallurgists like myself do. We just try and understand the metallurgical debris, and we use different methods to do that. Sometimes you can use non-destructive methods where you just look at the surface, you understand the chemistry and the surface morphology. You can be able to tell if it was hammered or if it was drawn. You can also be able to tell what composition within that, what metals are being represented, like this bead that was already classified as a copper bead, but it turns out to be bronze because you can't tell by looking at it. So we look at not just the bronze objects themselves, but the casting molds, like in this particular example, this one was used for making brass and it's found at Great Zimbabwe. And then you can, of course, look through the destructive methods. You can section that, polish, analyze through the microscope, and be able to tell the several phases that are represented within that. These are some of the phases that we're talking about, that we've got those changes that are happening in there, and these are still retained in the production debris. You can still see some of those in the finished products. The scanning electron microscopy can also tell you that, but more importantly, the finished products themselves, they also do speak to another whole complex set of innovations. The wire drawing technique was very common in Southern Africa, where you pull through soft metal like copper, bronze, brass, even gold, through very hard. You see that plaque with the different hole sizes. as you're pulling through that, you're reducing its size and you end up with a very thin wire like that, which you end up winding on a vegetal core or an animal hair, and you come up with bangles and several other wire work. That's very common in Southern Africa. But of course, casting was also another technique. And when it comes to casting, nobody did it better than the West Africans. The technology perhaps going back to around 10,000 in Ibo Uku and several other examples. The lost was, casting technique was very, very complex. You need to use a beeswax, which you carve first, and then you cover with, layers of clay slips, and then you fire the beeswax melt away. You're left with a cast where you can pour, the metal and do the casting. Very complex, but they were able to do it. And perhaps a big discovery was to do with how to mix the different metals, because trying to cast copper on its own, it's not very easy. But when you mix with tin, you of course produce bronze. The term bronze has just been used by almost everybody without really speaking to context. But at least in this particular example, dated to the 14th century, we see the Tada-seated figure there being cast almost from pure copper. So that shows that some people were really dedicated to some of this casting technology and technique. But more importantly is how do we then present this? We know that when these things are still, in their own context, like in this particular photograph from Benin, this is part of a shrine. It's mixed. You can see ivory there. You can see bells. You can see it is within its own context. Once you take it out from there, like we see in this particular case, you take it to the museums where there are bright lights and stuff. Then it becomes art, because you're now in the art museum. You take it to the fluorescence lighting typical museums like ours, then the artifacts. But we know that these things, they did speak to very complex African technology. So it's not just art, it's not just black magic, it's also science. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you so much for that presentation, Foreman. For our audience, if you have questions, we will be doing a question and answer period. So please post your questions in the chat box, and I'll be happy to address those questions. But we have one question, but I want to take the advantage of asking the questions to ask my own first, which is, you talked about Great Zimbabwe and the various myths related to that, the myths that outsiders came and taught people, how to do this, how to do that. And I think your field, right, metallurgy plays an important role in that, the idea of, in particular gold and both in terms of the myth, but also the systematic destruction of sites by Cecil Rhodes and others searching for gold. But I know it's been a long time it's been a while now since the era of majority rule in Zimbabwe, but I'm wondering to what degree those myths of outsiders and so on still impact the common understanding in Zimbabwe itself, or impact the way that site is presented.
Thank you. You touched two things there. So one has to do with the general perception of the people. I think there's no doubt at this stage that Great Zimbabwe was built by local people, and almost everybody in Zimbabwe understands this. And it's unfortunate that the colonial education that we used to receive used to denigrate local people. My first time going to Great Zimbabwe, I was a sixth grader then. I was just blown away by the size of that place and what you can see, the amount of achievements that you can see there. And even then at the time, because of the kind of education that you are getting that says anything made by Black people is backward and not close to anything that can compare with anyone, it made a lot of, it did not make a lot of sense at the time. to really accept that this place was really actually built by local people. Of course, as a sixth grader, there's still a lot of learning. When I went to university and I began to hear my professor talk about this, I began to realize, okay, so actually, there's a lot of damage. So it's possible that there's still a lot of people that may have questions. If we're still doing this, why did we stop? If we ever did it, why did we stop? There's some that may begin to question themselves in that way. But of course, we know that in terms of the presentation, there are recent changes that have been slowly proposed, but for a long time, because there was a moratorium on excavations at Great Zimbabwe, because of the looting that happened for a long time, there wasn't a lot of recent research going on, including excavations that were taking place at the site, except those that had to do with repairs and conservation. But we see that changed a little bit when we began to come into the scene. Starting from 2014, we began to excavate in areas that are outside the stone walling, and we began to see patterns that actually compare with what is within the stone walling. And we began, of course, to realize that it is actually very important for us to, at least now, because we've got new models and new ways of understanding this place, to begin to excavate again now with more observant eyes and current models, and to be able to understand this place much better. So there is ongoing changes that I hope will be implemented fully, but perhaps the progress is not as quick as others would want. If you get there, you see some of the site interpretations, they're still omitting some places. Some areas where there are stone walls, they have not been updated according to the current maps that we have just done in other areas. So there's still a lot that we will need to do in terms of the presentation. Unfortunately, the current economic situation in the country is not encouraging, some of those of that progress. The site is world class, but the presentation is not yet there. The presentation of the site still needs certainly to improve.
Wonderful, thank you. We have a question from Jessica. Do you know anything about the Ishango bone mathematical tool or the Lebombo bone lunar phase counter? And if so, can you briefly mention the significance of these tools?
I wouldn't want to, I think, delve deep into it. I've certainly heard about it. I grew up, in southeastern Zimbabwe, but we do trace our roots down to parts of South Africa and Swaziland, and we grew up hearing some of those stories. So I can tell you my understanding of that from within some of the stories that we grew up hearing. But the challenge with that is that there hasn't been any scientific analysis that have been done. And because of that, I think it becomes difficult for one to say with authority. But the mathematical, so math it's very complex. Most of the math that we see in Africa, it was certainly there. Some would be retained in some version of songs. Some will be retained in some version of some knots on the rope. Some will be found. I just showed you another example there of the Musuku ingot, that the miniature head with those little studs on top. All those were also used for counting and for calculating. And so there are several other ways in which math would have been incorporated. So, and one cannot certainly deny that.
I was wondering about, at the beginning, you mentioned that, you're new here to Chicago and finding your way around still. I know it took you a long time just to get here once you received the position. But I'm wondering, looking at the field and its exhibition, the way it presents Africa, if you have initial thoughts on ways that you'd like to revisit that exhibition, revise that exhibition, intervene in ways in the presentation of Africa at the field.
Yeah, no, definitely. Thank you so much for asking about that, because like I said at the beginning, we are looking for all the help we can get, for all the partners that can come. So with the current exhibit that was opened back in 1993, it is of course a bit dated, but most of the things they are already there. Where we need help is I think when it comes to Africa, we cannot continue with the usual. When it comes to Africa, it's a place that has already suffered a lot of prejudice. We either have to go big or go home. So we need now to speak to the story of Africa in a slightly different way than what was done in the past. We need to go and highlight those key innovations that we see within the African history, going all the way from the beginning of time until we get to the modern time. How is it that we ended up with Barack Obama as a president, for example? Is it something that just emerged after the slave trade, or that has just been the characteristics of humanity? To me, I think the story of Africa is more than just the story of Africa. It's the story of humanity. We need to highlight those connections, how the continent connected with the world in different ways, and how different people on the planet can be able to relate and to see at least how they connect, and we're connected with the world. So we need a lot of local partners. We need a lot of international partners, so that we get all the missing pieces and missing links all together. But that's the direction where we are going, and the whole process, of course, involves a bigger team than myself. But from my perspective, the main ideas that we hope to see in this course has to do with those African innovations. It has to do with the African connections within itself. How Egypt connected with the rest of the world is also very important, as well as connections of Africa and the rest of the world.
Yeah, I mean, that idea of Africa somehow being cut off and set off from the rest of the world is a long-standing problem, and yet, on the other hand, oftentimes when you try to show the connections and the relationships, oftentimes that can be equally problematic. So it's a difficult thing to address. But I think there's a question here that relates to this idea, and in terms of metallurgy, you had talked about this idea of smelting and ironworking and so on being introduced from the north, and the the counter proposals of independent invention in Africa. And there's a question here from Nicole Buccio, I hope I'm getting that right, asking, are there any theories of metallurgy diffusing outwards from Africa? Examples of African metalworks being, and also, oh, that's a separate question, sorry. Second question, are there any examples of African metalworks being made out of meteoric iron?
So as far as I know, there haven't been examples of the exportation of the African technology out of Africa. Theories put forward. Perhaps we have been putting too many fires, and we had no time to look at what else Africa could have exported out. We do know, for example, that in many parts of North Africa, North and West Africa, they were connected with Europe. I think you are familiar with how the Almoravids, for example, how they colonized Spain for over 100 years. And suddenly during that process, they introduced a lot of innovations. These were Islamized black people that were in North Africa, in the area around Morocco, that had their kingdom that was stretching all the way into Spain. And they introduced a lot of innovations at the time. There's a recent discoveries that we have just heard about the gold refining technology that was done again in North Africa by these Islamized North Africans, where they were using glass. So imported glass was used to refine gold. So gold that they ended up producing, most of the gold that perhaps you have on your finger, it's not as pure as it looks. There's a bit of some impurities within that. But these North Africans, they had a technology of using glass to refine gold. So they ended up producing very, very high grade gold, over 98% gold. So that was, those are some of those important innovations that, very few people do talk about. I think, with attention, because the challenge with innovations that they don't always come out until somebody does the research and they're able to highlight them. And so, there is one thing for sure, that a lot of this technology at the time must have been, I think there must have been some form of feedback going back, because most of the early travelers that were coming here, David Livingstone amongst others, they were reporting that what they were encountering here was very, very high grade. Very, very high grade compared to what was happening in Europe at the time. We do know that several of other local African metal objects, finished objects, were also being exported out to Europe. So that we certainly know. But whether that technology was then incorporated at the time is not clear. And we also realized that because the regions where this was being exported to, they already had their own existing metal technologies, and some of it was slightly different. At the time, it did not make sense for them to incorporate them. For example, if you're looking at the bloomery process, it's based on solid reduction, where you don't melt the iron. And then if you are using the blast furnace technology, everything must melt. Iron is heavier, it goes at the bottom, and the gangue material is drained from the top. So I think those differences in techniques and technology might have prevented perhaps a full-blown adoption of some of the technology. But I'm suspecting that, especially in those areas that are closer to the coast, Europe and others, North Africa, there's certainly some of those technologies must have been exported out.
Yeah, and this is a big part of, one of the former speakers we had was Kathleen Bickford-Birtsock, who talked about her exhibition Caravans of Gold. And of course, that exactly what you're talking about was a big part of that exhibition. And I'm sure it's easier to trace the material than it is to trace the technology and technique that produces it. But there's a very interesting question here. About the Americas. There's a question, is it true that there were slaves sent to the Americas who were coveted / chosen because of their metalworking skills?
Okay, so yeah, I'm not an expert in slave trade, but my understanding of the slave trade is that it didn't discriminate that much. The way people were chosen, to go out, would have, of course, depending on whether you are defeated or not. Sometimes, there may be local squabbles and fights, and the defeated end up being sold. But people of skill, whatever skill one has, would have been, of course, some of those important people to also include on the list. And I'm guessing that perhaps they might even have fetched a higher value when they were being sold because they had other special skills. Some, of course, who even knew languages better than others would have been also targeted. And it will not surprise me if some of them ended up being there. But it's one area that I'm not a specialist and wouldn't know much about. But this is exactly why we need a lot of collaborators and connections, so that we can be able to establish those relationships that we see between the Americas and Africa, for example, and the metal technologies that are there, as well as where they are coming from. We do know, of course, that several other forms of craft were also exported and survived, in the Americas. So metalworking would have been at least one of those, but perhaps because of the demands of why they were exported for sugarcane and other places, working in the sugar plantations. I think that might have distracted from some other key crafts for them surviving much longer.
Janet Purdy has a question that I understand that the Karagwe region had one of the earliest introductions of iron on the continent, and I'm interested in their bovine figures, especially because they are so rare. Are there any Karagwe objects in the Field Museum collection?
I am still learning that collection, but as far as I recall, I haven't come across that. I will certainly double check and perhaps come back to, if you can get my contacts, please get in touch, and then I can double check. I can double check for you. Please, if you can share my contacts, then I'm happy to double check for you.
Sure. Let's see. There's a series of questions here related to techniques of antiquity. A question, have these techniques of antiquity, oops, I just lost my chat. So, hold on a second.
Or I stopped sharing, maybe things that way.
It rearranged things, so technology is now defeating me. Here we go. I think I found it. Have these techniques of antiquity evolved into African art of today, and are they still being used? So perhaps a question about, ancient metalworking techniques and so on. Do these things continue into this present? Do they continue to be produced, or do we see a break?
They're different. So if you are going back to the full production line, that is not easy to find. It's gone. I think the early years of colonialism disrupted most of the smelting component, the mining and the smelting component. Most of the modern mines that we have in Africa, they are sitting right on top of the ancient mines. So those early prospectors, they didn't even need to read too many books. They just had to figure out where they were doing in the past, and they went and put modern mines. And you can guess whoever was doing it there, they were chased away. The same happened with many people that were relocated from the original areas, and the importation of cheaper metal, just disrupted the whole smelting process. What survived and is still perhaps very much ongoing today is the smithing component, because that can be done on any imported metal or whatever metal. That we still have several areas where it's still ongoing, including the casting technology, the lost casting technology. If you go to West Africa, parts of Nigeria and others, that technology is still ongoing. This is exactly why some have been calling for their return of those stolen objects, because they are saying that we need our own artists to be inspired and to learn from some of this and be able to continue the tradition. So yeah, there's the smithing component, as well as the wire drawing, the hammering and all those things, because that can be done with local or imported metal. So that has been ongoing. But the smelting part, I know most areas it's already gone. They are surviving, a few survivors, perhaps that knew or practiced as small boys, but those will be getting very thin every day. I know there are parts of Tanzania, parts of Kenya, and parts of East Africa and parts of West Africa where there are still a few survivors that are known, and they've even tried to replicate and did several videos that you can find on YouTube. But a good number of that technology is now lost and gone. What survived is, the carving, the smithing, the woodworking, and several others that seem to have survived, because anybody can do it from anywhere. With the metallurgy, especially the smelting component, you will need to get a lot of planning that goes into it. And with the disruptions, the movement of people, introduction of the modern education, the young people move out, the local ones have very little help. Imported metal is slightly cheaper. You can get it for without a lot of effort. So that's how most of this got lost. But there are a few museums that are trying to, try the smelting experiments and try and revive this and at least resuscitate it in some form. And I hope those will be able to do a bit of progress so that we don't have a complete loss.
I know certainly in northern Cameroon where I've worked, you can still see some of the furnaces and so on, but they're rarely used. It's much easier to take an old car part and beat it into whatever you need. There's a question here about, and I think getting to where you were talking about the integration of technology with the human body and ritual practice. Were there any prayers, incantations, or spoken word used in the processes of metallurgy? What's the relationship there?
So yeah, that was a very key component of most of this metallurgical process, especially the smelting part, which was done outside the village in restricted components. The rituals and perhaps some of the songs actually were speaking to the process. So if you understand the words, you would know that it's also trying to speak to the process. So there was a lot of those. Some of the songs are actually written down, so you can be able to go back to some of those songs and be able to recite them and to know what was involved, because it was very highly ritualized in most of the cases. It involved a lot of that. And also because you're also needing to pass time. Remember, if you're doing, for example, the natural draft style, you can go on for 4 or 5 days. This furnace is still burning. So by the time you get there, you need other ways of, pushing time. And you also need other ways of keeping people excited. And I think there was a lot of that was involved in that. Even in those contexts where it was not very, very ritualized, they still retained some songs, and some, recitations. So I think most of that technology would have been stored in some form of songs, but perhaps you had to work under somebody as an apprentice for you to get the full set of the knowledge. You couldn't get all of that from songs. So mostly the elders would be the one with the full set of the knowledge, but they needed the younger ones for the muscle and also for carrying out, the tradition after them. So you would have to continue under that master until you have mastered the technology yourself. That's how it was passed down. In most cases, depending on where you are, in some cases it was a family tradition, so it would have to be passed from father to son or from grandfather to grandchild. But in some cases, it was just open to those who were interested. So yeah, but most of it had to be word of mouth, observation, intuition, and other things for you to be able to grasp most of it. What is interesting is that today we know what's involved, or we say we know. We can measure it with the thermometer, we can do all sorts of things, but very few smelting experiments, at least the ones that I've been involved in, have been able to produce the metal, because it's not easy. It's really, really hard to be pumping those bellows for hours, unless if you decide to use the modern technology to to blow the air into the furnace. But if you want to follow everything with the dot, and there's a minimum number of conditions that you need to maintain for a minimum number of time. If it is iron, for example, before you are able to produce metal. So yeah, slag, we can produce slag, but to really go the way to produce metal, it's not very easy. Yeah, it takes a lot of skill and training.
There's I can't think of his name now, but there's a modern Senegalese artist who talks about the intelligence of the hand. You can know something, you can hear about how to do it, but until you actually do it with your hands and your hands learn the way, it's very hard to produce the end result.
That's very true.
There's a question from Gazebo Makatsa. I hope I pronounced that correctly. Is it true that the Ngwenya mine in Eswatini in Southern Africa is the oldest known mine in the world?
That's correct. So yeah, it is the oldest, but it has to do with the specularite that I was speaking about, the one that was used for decoration as powders for the face and for rock paintings and others. It was not used for metallurgy.
Okay. I was wondering if you could talk about, you mentioned the importance of wire, like drawing wire in Southern Africa in particular. And I'm wondering why, why that particular technique, and what advantages does it have? You know, is that wire the end product, or is it like a middle stage towards producing other things? If you could talk a little bit about that.
So the wire work is just like in West Africa, they were specializing more on the casting. I think it was just perhaps a tradition that they decided to do. But the wire that you produce is not the end product. But because you have wire that is soft and is colorful and the different shades, well, what they would do with that is that they would make some of that from copper, some from brass, some from gold, some from iron, and then they would do in some cases, mix and match them when they're making some, perhaps a handle for a ceremonial X. They can make some bangles, bling. They can make earrings from those. They can make even wound rings of some sort. But it's flexible wire that you can almost use on almost anything. And because it gives you a weaving option, so you can weave that into some form of a cloth, a cloth face, which you can do. And this seems to be put on a lot of handles for beauty and they make very, very good color contrasts, and sometimes when they are meshed and mixed. And because when they are corroding, then they or almost corroding, you can polish them and you can oil them and keep on getting more of those color contrasts. We are using that for ceremonial. They'll be very shiny and they'll be just a thing of beauty. In the same way that the casting also was producing a lot of other beautiful objects. I think for the Southern Africans, they just enjoyed the wires because they would do so much with that. So they would decorate their headrest, for example, those wooden pillows. They would decorate almost anything with those wires. And more importantly, I don't know if they were doing it for archaeologists, but at least now it's working. So some of the most preserved human remains that have been found are those that were put on those legs as the anklets, and still they preserve the skin and the body around. So most of at least the kind of surviving, because the copper in there would then be acting as a preservative. So some of the surviving human tissues that we can get from the past come from those, and the copper, like we said, because of its medicinal properties, it was also one for that. So people would put it on their bangles for those healing properties. And we know today that the good door handles must have some form of copper or brass or zinc, within that, so that it disinfects. I think in the period of COVID, you need that disinfecting door handle.
You need more copper. Yeah, if I could add, we're coming close to the end of time here, but I wanted to ask one more question of you. That's maybe a big question, but you had mentioned about ironworking technology and this question of whether it was imported or independently discovered, if you want. I've often heard that you know, whereas in the European context, we talk about the Bronze Age and then the Iron Age following the Bronze Age, and that in Africa it's for the large part reverse, that you have an Iron Age and then you have bronze appearing after that. Is that a result of the prevalence of iron ore as opposed to copper ore or something like this, or is there some explanation for why that's reversed?
I think it's perhaps there's very little explanation for that, but it's actually another example or another evidence that the technology was not borrowed from outside. Because if they had acquired the technology from Europe and Asia, there's no reason for them to take iron and copper only. And then after several centuries, then think of, let's start doing bronze and gold. Because we know that Europe and Asia at the time, they were already interested in gold. There's no way they were not going to tell them about gold. So if the technology was really, really imported from Europe and Asia, then gold and brass, bronze would have been a part of it from the beginning. But we see, at least later on, the beginning of brass and bronze seem to be linked to, the entertaining the idea of gold. Because gold, most of the gold, of course, there were some that made local products, but in Southern Africa, for example, a big majority of the gold was just exported out because people didn't really see that much value in gold, at least not as the Europeans and the Asians were putting the value in gold. What they considered to be important was copper, obviously, because they had already had an existing local logic. The color red fitted with ancestors and several other things. But what they did is that for them to have their version of gold, which had copper in it, they had to then mix with tin and brass. So because when you polish bronze or when you polish brass, it looks like gold. Then they have gold, but this gold is made with the preferred metal. So that was much more preferable. So it seems to be that at the time they're beginning to do bronze and brass, that they're doing it because they're seeing that, these European people that are coming, they're interested in this color. But besides the color, they are not seeing anything else too nice about the gold. So they decided to go on with, we can make that color, but using the preferred metal. So yeah, they were not prepared to export a lot of copper, brass, bronze, but gold, they were happy to give away. The brass and bronze seem to be fitting in a lot of their local logic. And besides, gold is boring. You can't do anything. It's just one color. What else do you do?
But that points to the idea that, I guess part of what we value in gold is scarcity, but there are other values to be applied to metals. If the color red is prioritized, then that may not be related to scarcity, but rather the way that metal is integrated with local cultural ideas about color and its importance. Well, thank you. This has been a wonderful experience. Thank you so much for presenting and taking so many of our questions and responding with such wonderful ideas. I really appreciate that. I'm going to turn it back over to Julie now to lead us out here.
Yeah, I really love this presentation, and I echo all that's in the chat where people are like, this is excellent, it's interesting, we love it. And there's a comment from Janet Purdy. Thank you for a wonderful talk. A big welcome to Chicago from the Arts of Africa Department at the Art Institute. We share your goals of reconnecting Egypt to the rest of Africa, and we cannot wait to work with you. So thanks to all of you for attending, and thank you so much, Dr. Bandama. It's a wonderful, wonderful presentation.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yes, have a wonderful evening. Thanks to you, Mark. Bye.
Thank you.